Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Scott McLean, and today I'm going to talk about one particular theme of landscapes of conflict and landscapes of power. Now there's many things in British history that I could focus on to try and drive this home, to see what's really important about how landscapes have been used to symbolize the power of different groups. And I thought, well, first of all, Roman Britain comes to mind. There's so many things we could look at. But one particular year really stood out for me that I think illustrates this point, and that is 1066. Now, this is a year that we're very familiar with, that most people know something about, particularly because we have some very good sources. Most importantly, the Bayou Tapestry. This tells the story of 1066, a year of battles. This was a conflict between three great figures: Harold Hardrada, a Viking king of Denmark, Harold Godwinson, the Anglo-Saxon king of England, and William of Normandy. All three of these individuals thought they had a right to the throne of England. Most everyone knows at least a little about the famous Battle of Hastings, which took place in the autumn of 1066. Here the forces of William, Duke of Normandy, fought the Anglo-Saxon army of King Harold Godwinson. We know a great deal about this battle due to the famous Bayou Tapestry, which provides a pictorial blow-by-blow of the battle and how William of Normandy would at the end of the day be victorious. Winning the battle meant that William would be able to proclaim himself King of England, but it didn't mean that everyone would accept him as their new ruler. William had won the battle and still had a significant army behind him, including all of the mounted knights who had survived the battle, but this was far from enough. The problem William had was that he was in England. He just killed the Anglo-Saxon king and many of the prominent men from leading families, something which no doubt helped him, as it meant that it was going to be hard to organize a resistance movement. But there was still the simple fact that he and his army numbered somewhere around 5,000 men. He was in England, surrounded by about 1.5 to 2 million angry Anglo-Saxons. They weren't particularly pleased with their new French ruler. So how then was it possible for the Normans to solidify their position and maintain control of England? The answer is through the creation of symbols of power and control of the landscape. Following the battle, William immediately had to march towards London, moving up towards Canterbury and then into London, where he'd be crowned King of England on Christmas Day 1066. One of the first actions he took was to start construction of two great symbols of power: the keep at Dover Castle, which is where he would be moving back and forth between his lands in England and France, and the Tower of London. Both were constructed with white limestone brought to England from William's estates in Normandy. The significance of this is that there were no castles in England prior to the Norman conquest, so you can imagine what it must have been like for those Anglo-Saxons who for the first time would come upon such a formidable, powerful looking structure which dominated the landscape around them. And this is key to understanding how the Normans were able to conquer and dominate. There are many factors involved in how the Normans were able to take control and to maintain it in this position of power in England. But the one factor is the castle. It is really the most important, and it's one particular form of castle. In the early days, this was known as a Mote and Bailey Castle. What you would do is basically dig a ditch or a moat, and you would create a large cone of soil, a small hill. Sometimes they would use the existing landscape. At other times, this was all just created on their own. And with the soil you took out of digging the moat, you made the cone, and then on top of that hill, you would put a keep. Now initially, these were always just wooden structures. It's whatever you could put up quickly. So think of wooden stakes with pointy ends in it, and then you would build your keep on, or a little fort on the inside. Gradually, as time went by, these were then converted. As they solidified their position, they then took down the wood and they built out of stone. So much more formidable structures like Clifford's Tower in York, the keep at Arundel Castle in West Sussex, and Motte and Bailey's all across England. We see them virtually everywhere popping up. It's estimated that by the time we get to 1100, there could have been as many as 1,000 Motte and Bailey castles throughout England and Wales. It was through this establishment of Motte and Bailey castles that they were able to spread their control north and west, and this allowed them to dominate the regions in which they settled. They also led directly to the great castles of the later Middle Ages, such as those of Edward I in the north of Wales. Throughout this period, despite all the Mote and Bailey Castles and the larger castles which would come later, the Welsh proved particularly recalcitrant and hard to dominate. It wasn't until Edward I in the 1280s that he was able to finally bring the Welsh to heel. And this is through these massive big castles like Conwy Castle, Carnarvon, and others. A whole string of them which just dominate the region and were the biggest castles ever seen. They were based upon castles which Edward I had seen in the Middle East while he was on crusade. But it wasn't just the development of castles that allowed the Normans to dominate and control. It was also religion. Religion played a major role because what we see is that everywhere that castles are established, churches soon followed. So they go hand in hand. And quite often in many places across England and Wales now where you have a Motte and Bailey Castle, you will find a church right beside it. And so religion was very important as well. And it wasn't that the Anglo-Saxons were used to it. They were Christians. They'd been Christians for centuries. But this was a different kind of Christianity. When William the Conqueror came over, he brought with him Benedictine monks from his territories in France, in Normandy. And they were given lands and they were establishing themselves. And churches changed. Anglo-Saxon churches tend to be small, simple structures. Now we are into this grand Norman architecture. So again, really dominating the landscape, something that screams power and control. This was very important for the control that the Normans would wage and how they would be able to control much of England. So the significance of religion and the new religious orders and the new Norman dominance of the landscape is perhaps best seen in the establishment of one particular Benedictine Monastery. And this is the one which is sited right at what is known as the town of Battle. This is the site of the Battle of Hastings. So you're in the south of England in East Sussex, just north of Hastings. And after the battle, once William got established as king, he granted this vast territory of land to the Benedictine monks. And this became one of the most wealthy monasteries or monastic communities in all of England. When he gave them this land, they went and looked at the site and thought, well, this isn't very good. And so they started building their monastery 2 miles away. Once William heard of this, he put a stop to it and forced them to abandon that site and go back to where he actually won the battle. And this really tells us about the way the landscape could be used and the power that it held. Because when they built their church, the church was built right over what we are told is the exact spot where the battle took place, in the town of Battle. And we know that it's generally in that area. The high altar of the church was placed right where Harold Godwinson was to have died. He took that arrow in the eye, and then he was struck down by a Norman knight. And you think of the symbolism of that anybody going there would know that that high altar in that church sat right above where the king of the Anglo-Saxons had died. And what amazes me is that to this very day, when you go and visit, virtually every time I've ever visited there, you go there and there will be flowers laying on the grave that sits there. And so people are still recognizing, that this is the burial place of Harold Godwinson, the end of the Anglo-Saxon era, and that this was that great symbol that William had won. He was the rightful king, and he was now the one in control of England. So I hope you got something out of this. I hope you can see the importance of these structures and how the Normans not only just won the battle, but they dominated the landscape. And this was the way that they consolidated their power and were able to maintain in control for a very long time in England. Thank you.